Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today I'd like to speak about a new addition to my collection from Zodiac. And this piece in many ways follows on from my my review of the Page & Cooper event, which showcased the arrival of Zodiac in the UK as a brand. And Zodiac is a brand with a very rich history in terms of innovation, but over the last few years they've really been picking up under their ownership by the Fossil Group, which I really don't view as a bad thing. I think in fact it's a very helpful thing for the brand, and has allowed them to do some things which other brands simply can't, but I'll explain that later on in the video. And I think it was nice to see the Page & Cooper event where a company such as Page & Cooper, that those who watch the channel regularly will know is my most trusted seller of watches in the UK, in terms of selling very interesting brands, but also being very honest and reliable about the way they work. And I think it was a nice introduction to Zodiac for the UK. And so this piece comes as a rather interesting balance between a vintage dive watch and something far more contemporary, because this is the Super Sea Wolf 53, and in fact those who follow me on Instagram will already have seen it, but if you don't, and in fact do go and follow me if you don't already follow me there, those who have seen it will already know this is an extremely bright timepiece. And in terms of this piece's origins, it is an interesting balance in terms of taking from that original 1953 watch, but implementing it in a very interesting and very novel format. And without any further ado, I'll take this watch out of the packaging, which is this rather attractive cardboard top external case, which is simple but I think very well executed and protects the internal case, which is altogether more ornate, and takes the form of this wooden piece with this graining to it and this applied Zodiac logo. But I'll take the box out of this external case and talk about that further. And as you can see, if one takes it out of that cardboard box, the internal packaging is extremely well detailed, with this wooden grain to it, as you can see, and with a rather appealing hinge on the back as well. It's nicely cut as well, in addition to these attractive polished feet. But of course the main article here really to speak about is the watch, but I felt the packaging was important to talk about, bearing in mind the fact this is a £1,000 watch, and as such there's a great deal of variation in what brands offer for that sort of price. I think they've done an extremely good job here. But if one opens the box, one sees the brightness of this timepiece, and it's housed in this sort of nubuck feeling material. And if one pops it out, you'll see it is also on the bracelet, which gives another element to talk about really in this review, because I don't normally wear watches on bracelets, but I haven't taken this watch off the bracelet since I first started wearing it. And so here's the watch outside the box, and as you can see it's an extremely bright piece. And in terms of its history, this watch is based on the silhouette of the original Sea Wolf, released in 1953. And that piece had a 100-metre water resistance, then a 200-metre water resistance. And this doesn't take inspiration from the early versions, which featured brushed bezels and Dauphine-style hands, but rather takes inspiration from later versions of the Sea Wolf, and as you can see has this much more 60s sort of feel to it, thanks to these bright colours, and a general feel which is perhaps more playful than early 1950s black dive watches. And to first speak about the dimensions of this piece, it comes in at 40mm from side to side, although if you discount the bezel, which as you can see overhangs the case slightly, it's a 39mm case, with a 49mm lug-to-lug length, which is surprisingly long for a watch of this size, but due to their very heavy curvature, as you'll see when I put the watch on, it fits extremely comfortably and wears quite small. And then across the height of the watch, it's 13mm thick, which does make it a very wearable thickness. And also one does have to accept that's including the heavily bubble-domed style of box crystal on the top of the watch. But in terms of its general build, it has a 200-metre water-resistant case and a screw-down crown, as you can see, but I'll talk more about the crown later on. And the case has this wonderful balance of finishing, because it has these polished tops of the lugs, polished elements on the tip of the lugs, and then this vertical brushing on the sides of the case, which is extremely well done, I must say, for this price, and certainly does have detail which represents the brand extremely well. Then if one looks over towards the other side of the case, one has an unguarded crown. As you can see, it juts out directly from the side of the case, and one has this rotating bezel on the top of the watch as well. And this creates a build which is perhaps quite conservative and quite classic in terms of its features, but works extremely well to make a very comfortable dive watch to wear. And that part of that comfort can also be assigned to the bracelet, but I will talk about that later on. Then if one looks to the case back, it's a solid case back, and I'll talk more about the detailing as I talk more about the case, but it doesn't feature an exhibition case back, instead simply has the Zodiac logo. And so the watch itself is, as I've said, inspired by that period in the 1950s and 60s, and as such is more of a skin diver than a sort of a professional dive watch, and I think fits that role extremely well with the sort of the ambiance and the air of bright colours of that period, freediving competitions, and these sorts of events which seem almost as though they've jumped straight out of a 60s Bond film. But certainly the detailing on this watch is superb, and the case is no exception really, because as I've said, the brushing is extremely well done, and one does have a case shape which is very distinctive to this model, and especially the vintage versions, where the lugs jut directly out of this circular form of the case and aren't continued. And I think this purity to the original aesthetic, albeit the fact that this watch has grown by 4mm, allows the watch to still remain very comfortable, but also very classic on the wrist, and I think this is a watch which could be worn just as formally as it could in a sporting sort of context, thanks to its general shape and design. And aside from the general case shape, the detailing on this watch really helps it to take on that vintage form, that vintage feel. And this is seen immediately in the crown, for example, which as you can see sits quite close to the case and thus doesn't risk snagging on anything, but is unguarded, as I've said. But it's the form of the crown which is extremely well observed, because whilst it features a very deeply etched and an extremely well engraved style of Zodiac logo, it does have the advantage of looking like a mid-century crown. So it has this domed section, of course fully polished, with this knurling behind it. And whilst this may seem like a small detail, those who handle a fair amount of vintage dive watches will know that a lot of dive watches of this period did have crowns of this sort, and so it feels much more plausible than the very large crowns you would see on some of the more rare vintage watches like the Rolex 6538. But most had small crowns like this, which I think does lend to a very interesting aesthetic with this watch. And of course, though, it does have the modern complication of a screw-down form, and screws in very, very effectively, and gives a very satisfying sort of clonk when it pops out. But it's very well machined and very well milled, and certainly is able to provide a very reasonable water resistance of 200 metres. But aside from that, the bezel also takes on this very vintage aesthetic, and having seen this piece compared by the side of the 35mm original, it's striking to see how close they are. Because the edge of the bezel, as you can see, is not like a modern bezel perhaps as complex in terms of various finishings. Instead, it just has an extremely finely polished surface, and has this very functional, quite utilitarian edge, which is coin-edged. And this does give a very good grip of the 120-click bezel, which moves around with real precision, and there really is no play in that once it's set. But it does complement the bezel insert. And this does come in a variety of versions in terms of the inserts and the colours available. But this particular version, as is often described, is the watermelon version, as has been nicknamed. And it takes on this eau du Nil style of colour, which is this wonderful greeny blue, and offsets the silver of the dial extremely well. And the bezel itself is it's a particular type of mineral crystal onto which they print the colour on the back of it, and then they also apply the luminous marker onto the back of that crystal. And this means that you get a very smooth, glossy surface with real depth that you don't get with ceramic, and is a nice alternative, I feel, to the existing options on the market, such as aluminium, for example. And it's graduated relatively sparingly, simply being graduated with a numeral at 30 and a large triangle at 12, with these individual graduations around the edge. But it gives real balance to it, and once it's realigned at the 12 o'clock position, it allows the watch to take on a certain symmetry that otherwise it wouldn't have. Then, of course, one has to look to the dial, because it continues this theme of coloration. And as you can see in the centre of the dial, one has this fantastic sunburst effect silver dial, and it's a crisp and quite cold silver, which offsets the brightness of the colours very effectively. And onto that one sees an applied Zodiac logo, which is polished metal, and matches the hands very well, but I'll talk about that slightly later on, because it's a characteristic of this watch in terms of its applied elements on the dial, which really are of very high quality. And around that one sees these applied luminous markers, which have the same tone as the bezel on their surface, instead of being polished metal, and also match the minute hand, which is also painted in that colour. And this is a sort of matte colour on the edges of those markers, whilst the minute hand is a glossy colour, though I will explain that later on as I talk about the handset. And then around the edge of that one sees this pinky orange sort of colour on that set of minute tracks, which I think is an attractive touch, and also thanks to the alignment of the hands, means that looking straight on, all of the hands meet that extremely effectively. And so the minute hand breaks the markers down the middle, and the second hand reaches the very edge of the dial, aside from that coloured rim. And where the dial is concerned in terms of text, one has the Zodiac logo beneath, or rather the Zodiac text logo beneath the applied logo, with their traditional font for Super Sea Wolf, which was used on the original Sea Wolf, and then beneath automatic 200 metres, 660 feet. And this is all printed in black apart from the depth rating, which is in burgundy, which I think is a nice colour to offset the existing colours on the dial. And where the applied marker for the Zodiac logo at 12 is concerned, it's extremely well polished to a very, very high mirror shine, which is not normal, bearing in mind the fact that one has these extremely sharp edges. And this is repeated on the hands, because as you can see as they go past, the second hand has extremely crisp borders. Now normally when one sees polished hands, the edges are quite soft, with the exception perhaps being Grand Seiko or Seiko's higher end offerings, which are always impeccable in this regard. But this is a much less expensive watch, and so it is impressive they're able to provide this. And I think this does link back to Zodiac's position on the market, which is unique, as I mentioned in a previous video. And this is also applied to the function and design of the hour hand, which matches that, whilst the minute hand has this rather glossy and rather appealing green colour to it. Then placed at 3 o'clock position, one has the date, which has a font which I think matches the dial very, very well, and also is faceted, as you can see, so one doesn't have an abrupt break in the dial, but rather a subtle sort of break down towards that opening. And if one turns the watch over and looks at the case back, the various elements of this watch become clear. One has Zodiac 1882, their year of establishment, Swiss made, 200 meters, but one also has this rather wonderful, extremely deeply engraved and cut Zodiac logo. And the case back is subtly domed, which is very much something of those mid-century dive watches, if my camera will focus, to give this subtle dome into the wrist, and is circularly brushed to give a subtle but well-defined form to that. Now, while speaking about this, I think it's important to speak about the movement inside this watch, because inside this watch beats the Zodiac, or rather the STP caliber 3-13, and this is a member of the Fossil group, and it's their own proprietary movement made for the Fossil group, but also it is sold to some third-party companies. And this is an evolution on their previous 1-11, which was a movement which was a fairly similar sort of movement to an ETA 2824. Like the Sleater SW200, it used the same architecture. However, in this case, it had a longer power reserve of 44 hours, and also the finishing was really excellent throughout, with decoration all across the movement itself, which is not something you see for this sort of price in an ETA movement. And in this case, though, one sees the 3-13, which is an evolution on that, and represents something which will fill out the whole of the Zodiac range on any new models. And this takes the existing 1-11 and adds a swan neck regulator to it, which gives it more stable and more fine adjustment when it is regulated. And it should be noted that Zodiac only uses one grade of movement, so whether they're chronometer watches or non-chronometer, all are chronometer grade. And so whereas with a lot of brands a movement isn't simply not chronometer certified, but it's not produced at tolerances where it would stay within that certification even if regulated, all of these movements are built to that standard, which again is not something you expect to see for £1,000. The beat rate of the watch also remains 4 Hz, so 8 ticks a second, and so you get this very smooth run to the second hand, which isn't like a 36,000 vibration per hour high beat movement, but it's a very good standard for these watches to keep, and does maintain a smooth and aesthetically pleasing tick to them, and of course is manually wound as well as automatic, with hacking and of course the quick set date. And so I think this is a very good choice of movement for this watch in terms of providing a very reasonable level of accuracy, especially due to the fact that this watch can be regulated to well within chronometer certification, but also with regards to keeping up with Sleater and ETA offerings. And the whole display of this watch is seen through this rather attractive style of sapphire crystal. And as you can see, it does have this slight sheen of an anti-reflective coating, whilst also having this boxed form. And unlike the bezel, which sits flush with its mountings, this does rise out of the front of the watch and gives a wonderful sort of view of the dial, which as you can see is extremely good, where the surface of the crystal is double domed, and so one doesn't have that sort of very heavy distortion that one might expect to see. And so I think as a general display, this watch is extremely legible, but does have that very nice balance of something which is far more aesthetically pleasing than something which is designed exclusively to be impressive from a specifications standpoint. And the bracelet is an interesting element to speak about on these watches, because the bracelet on this watch is produced exclusively for models which are sold with it, and due to the nature of Zodiac as a brand which operates like a very, very small brand, as an arm of the Fossil group, it doesn't at the moment sell the bracelet separately. And also in the past, these watches and the general standard for the Sea Wolf 53 was that it didn't have unified case builds. And what this means is that on older versions, the strap versions couldn't fit a bracelet because of the placement of the spring bar, whereas on these new versions that's been standardised, and so any of these cases can now take the bracelet. But if you do choose to go for one with the bracelet, then you get this rather attractive 5-link style of Jubilee bracelet, which is extremely well built, but adds to that vintage style this watch has. Now the links are all solid, as you can see, and polished and brushed to exactly the same standard as the case, which is nice to see when a lot of brands provide something which isn't quite so well finished for the bracelet, because it's not quite such a core component. I do like the fact that this is very well finished. And it does take a very classic Jubilee style to it, with those narrow links in the centre in polished steel and the brushed outer links. And it tapers down from 20mm to about 16mm at the deploying clasp, which itself I will devote some time to. And it doesn't feature screws, but rather features pins and collars. And this is an area of debate and contention as to what actually is more resilient. From my experience, screws, if they're single-sided screws like one often sees, can unscrew themselves over time, but it's something very gradual, and I haven't noticed any problems with that. And similarly, one has the inconvenience of sizing a pin style of bracelet, but in this case it's not too much of a bother, and the pins came out extremely easily with a firm click and pop. And so far, having worn this watch for a few weeks, there's been no problem whatsoever, which would lead me to believe that perhaps this is a slightly more secure system, but I must say the difference is negligible. But the beauty of this bracelet is that despite being a modern bracelet, it's built to feel like a vintage one. And so the lugs, as they curve outwards towards the wrist, have this additional sort of shape, which means that the first link of the bracelet is found actually within their length. And so this means the bracelet can hang down extremely tightly against the wrist. And thanks to the fact that each link is extremely narrow in terms of its thickness, the whole bracelet is extremely fluid, and as you can see, can be rolled up very, very tightly if you so wish. And this is a real contrast to wearing a modern bracelet which is heavier and in many ways feels slightly sturdier on a general basis, but doesn't have this sort of fluid feel. And so I think what they've been able to hit here is the ideal balance between something which is as flimsy as a vintage bracelet with rolled links, and indeed something which is modern, which is a bit too stiff on the wrist. So here you get the resilience to any sort of shock or pull of solid links, but you also get that fluidity. And a similar sort of appeal is found in the clasp. And it should be noted that on some of the new limited editions, I have noticed they have started releasing a more conventional style of clasp, but I do rather like this style because it goes with the general feel of the watch. The fact this watch is designed to be a piece enjoyable in the summer, when you've gone on holiday somewhere exotic and you're by the sea, as opposed to something used by a professional diver in the North Sea. And so the curious thing about this sort of pull-on is that it isn't a conventional style, but rather has this butterfly form. And as you can see, clamps down extremely well there, and the Zodiac logo crosses and bridges the gap between each side. It's also sprung, so depending upon the size of your wrist and whether you want to move around on the wrist, it's actually sprung so it will extend by a certain amount to be able to accommodate movement in the wrist. And from my experience, this makes it a very comfortable bracelet to wear, because there are no points where it gets caught on your wrist in an awkward way, because that spring accounts for it. And what does really shine through with this watch is the way Zodiac go about making their watches. And I did explain this in a previous video, but I think since I'm handling this one in my collection now, it's worth pointing this out. They are a brand which operates like an old-fashioned small brand, in the sense that whilst they're provided with the funding by the Fossil Group, they operate completely autonomously. And what this means is they have the freedom to innovate and design as they please, whilst having the financial help of being able to have the backing of STP, the in-house movement maker for the Fossil Group. And so as a result, they're able to access the best movements in the price range, whilst also having the ability to look to their history in a far more relaxed way. And so in this case, one sees a watch which is a really wonderful hark back to those past days of Zodiac, whilst also having a feel which is very much that of a watch produced on a small production run. And this is very much the case because whether the watches are made in a limited edition or simply a standard production model, once a finite number of these watches have been made, production ceases and there's no way of getting hold of a past model. And this can happen in a matter of months, which I think does put the brand's style and the style of production into perspective. That if you buy a watch, there's a very good chance very, very few other people will ever be able to get hold of one. And I think that does add appeal to this watch because it means you have something which isn't simply one of many, but something a bit more of a personal touch, and something which fits with an individual a bit better. And I feel at this point I should show the watch on the wrist, because it is a key component of wearing this watch on a regular basis. And as you can see on my wrist, which is just under 7 inches in circumference, the watch fits extremely comfortably. And it does wear quite long for a 39mm watch, as it does extend out across the wrist. However, thanks to the fact that the lugs are very heavily dropped, it does mean that it curves around the wrist, and actually you lose a great deal of that length, because the bracelet itself can be pinched to fit vertically downwards if you have a wrist which is shorter than this lug length. And so as a result, it's a very versatile watch, especially to wear on the bracelet. And that spring-loaded setup does mean that if you move your wrist, it will just account for the movement sufficiently to be able to prevent the watch from ever becoming anything more than slightly snug. It also does retain stability if you rotate the bezel, and I am wearing the watch slightly loosely, but it does retain stability and doesn't pose any sort of problem on the wrist. And so now I'll turn the lights out and show you the watch in the dark to be able to demonstrate the lume on this timepiece. And so here's the watch in the dark, and as you can see the hands and the dial light up extremely extensively with C3 superluminova. And unlike some other dive watches, the 12 o'clock marker is not a different shape to the others. However, you can still differentiate where the 12 is by the fact there is no lume pip at 3 o'clock. And it should be noted this watch isn't really going to compete with something like a Seiko Marine Master for brightness, because it's a very different market. But I think what this watch does achieve is a very usable level of legibility and a long longevity for the brightness of this watch, with the brightness of the lume lasting about 6 hours. With general use and for an ease of legibility, though it does continue to glow to some extent beyond that point. And you can see, one can see the paddle second-hand rotating around the dial with that rectangle, whilst the break in the lume on the hour hand means that you can very quickly differentiate which hand you're looking at. Then if one looks at that pip at 12 o'clock on the bezel, there is actually a certain amount of bleed of light coming off that pip through the rest of the bezel itself, and this gives a quite charming glow to it, but does mean that you still have a very legible point to be able to gauge time from. And so I think in terms of the lume on this watch, it's a very satisfactory sort of setup. I think bearing in mind the amount of lume on the dial, they've done a very good job. And so to conclude, it does feel like this watch really is a wonderful reinterpretation of what a dive watch of that period would be like if it was still produced in the original form today, with admittedly some tweaks, but without trying to appear vintage, but just whilst maintaining and preserving the style of the original. And certainly the finishing of the watch speaks for itself in terms of the general wear and enjoyment of the piece. And as a general build, I think it's a glorious piece to be able to enjoy and to be able to wear on a regular basis. There's something very different to other dive watches on the market. It doesn't take itself too seriously. Instead, it feels far more like a watch which is designed to give you 200 metres of water resistance, good legibility and a functional bezel, whilst also giving you all the style and all the nostalgia of seeing films from that period, and indeed enjoying the sort of aesthetic of that time. And so with that in mind, I'll conclude the video here, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of this watch, and indeed what you thought of the video in general. And if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. Armand the Watch Guy, out.